April 5th, 2023, Marsha Langston, a 47-year-old nurse from Dallas, boarded a plane to Jakarta with a suitcase, a heart full of hope, and a promise to call her sister as soon as she landed. By the next morning, her phone was dead silent. No one heard from her again. Back home, her sister Trina waited by the phone, sending message after message. Not knowing that halfway across the world, Marsha had walked straight into a trap. What happened to Marsha Langston? And how far would her family go to bring her home? If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a case that will leave you speechless. And if you're back, welcome. You already know this one's going to hit hard. Marsha Langston was 47 years old. She lived alone in a small apartment just outside Dallas, Texas. Every morning, she put on her hospital scrubs, tied back her hair, and walked into her nursing shifts without complaint. She had been doing this for years. Marsha was the kind of woman people call dependable. She was the one who always stayed late when the hospital was short-staffed. She never raised her voice, never missed a shift, and never let anyone down. But when she came home, there was no one waiting for her. She had no husband, no children, and no circle of friends. Her parents had passed away years ago, and the only person she spoke to regularly was her younger sister, Trina. Trina called her every evening, just to check in, just to hear her voice. Marsha was a quiet person. She did not go out much. She rarely attended parties or gatherings. Her world was small, her days filled with work, her nights filled with television and books. But at night, when she was alone, Marsha logged onto her favorite social media apps. It was there, on one of those lonely nights, that she met Dimas Harrio. He was from Indonesia, a man who called himself a businessman. He was kind in his messages, charming even, and he made Marsha feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Wanted. They talked every day. He sent her pictures of the places he wanted to take her. He told her she was beautiful. Marsha found herself laughing at his jokes, waiting eagerly for his texts, and dreaming of something bigger than the small world she had known for so long. Weeks turned into months. Marsha's coworkers noticed a change in her. She smiled more. She seemed lighter. She even started humming under her breath as she worked. When they asked her what was new, she blushed and said it was nothing. But to Trina, she told the truth. She had met someone. She was happy. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a reason to look forward to the future. Then one day, Dimas invited her to visit him in Indonesia. He said he wanted to show her his country, introduce her to his friends, and finally meet her in person. Marsha was nervous, but she was excited. She stood in the hospital break room, holding her phone tightly in her hand. She had just finished talking to her supervisor and was smiling softly. She told her coworkers that she had been approved for vacation leave. For the first time in years, Marsha Langston was taking time off just for herself. When she called her sister Trina later that night, her voice was light and filled with excitement. She told Trina that she had booked a ticket to Jakarta. She was going to meet Dimas in person. She described how they had been talking every day and how much she trusted him. Trina sat quietly on the other end of the call, listening. She felt a tightness in her chest as she heard the joy in her sister's voice. Trina was worried. She asked Marsha if she was sure this was safe. She asked if she had checked all the details. Marsha laughed softly and told her she had never been so sure of anything. Trina wanted to be happy for her, so she told Marsha she would be praying everything went well. Marsha spent the days before her trip texting constantly with Dimas. He sent her pictures of his neighborhood, his favorite restaurants, and the places he wanted to take her. He sent long voice messages saying how excited he was to hold her in his arms. He told her how lucky he felt to have found her. At night, Marsha sat on her bed, scrolling through their old conversations. She read his sweet words over and over, smiling to herself as she imagined the life they might build together. She thought about what to pack, which outfits he would like, and which perfume to bring. In the mornings, she stood by her apartment window with her coffee, imagining what Jakarta would look like. She imagined walking beside Dimas, exploring markets, and tasting new foods. She had spent so many years watching life from the sidelines. Now she felt like she was finally stepping into her own story. As the day of her flight approached, Marsha grew more restless. She began checking her messages even more often. She wanted to hear his voice constantly. She wanted every detail to be perfect. She double-checked her documents, counted her travel money, and practiced small phrases in Indonesian she had looked up online. On her last night in Texas, she met with Trina for coffee. Trina hugged her tightly and told her to be careful. Marsha promised she would. She said she would call as soon as she landed. She told Trina that she had never been this happy before. When Marsha left the coffee shop that night, Trina sat alone at the table for a long while. She watched the door where her sister had just walked out and felt a knot of worry in her stomach. But she reminded herself that Marsha deserved to be happy, and maybe this was finally her time. On the morning of her flight, Marsha stood at the airport with her small suitcase and her phone in hand. She sent Demas a picture of herself waiting at the gate. He sent back a heart emoji and a message saying, "I can't wait to see you." Marsha smiled. Her heart pounded with excitement as the boarding call came over the loudspeaker. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to meet the man she believed would change her life forever. On April 5th, 2023, Marsha left Dallas for Jakarta. She stepped off the plane at Soekarno-Hatta International Airport. She clutched her small carry-on bag and looked around nervously until she spotted Demas standing near the arrival gate, smiling and waving. Demas approached her quickly, wrapping her in a tight hug. Marsha felt herself blush, smiling shyly as she breathed in the scent of his cologne. They spoke quietly to each other, laughing at how strange but exciting it was to finally meet in person. Demas called for a taxi, and soon they were weaving through Jakarta's crowded streets, the city lights blurring past car windows. They checked into a small hotel not far from the city center. The room was simple but clean, and Marsha placed her suitcase carefully by the bed. That evening, Demas took her to a nearby restaurant, where they shared plates of food she had never tried before. They leaned close across the table, taking selfies and laughing as they posed with their chopsticks. Marsha texted Trina between bites, sending a quick message that she had landed safely and was having dinner. She promised to call the next day to tell her everything. Trina sent back a heart emoji and told her to get some rest after her long flight. Marsha felt a glow of happiness as she slipped her phone into her bag. Later that night, back at the hotel, Marsha stood at the window, looking out over the city. She could hear the faint sounds of traffic below and distant music from nearby restaurants. Demas told her he would be right back and stepped out of the room. Marsha sat on the bed brushing her hair, feeling relaxed and happy, ready to sleep off the jet lag. But at 3:17 a.m., everything changed. Marsha was jolted awake by the sound of the door crashing open. She barely had time to react before masked men rushed into the room. One of them grabbed her roughly, covering her mouth to stop her from screaming. Another pulled her arms behind her back, tying them tightly. Her heart pounded as she struggled, but it was no use. Within moments, a blindfold was shoved over her eyes. She could hear muffled voices speaking quickly in a language she did not understand. She called out for Demas, her voice shaking, but there was no answer. She strained to listen for his footsteps, his voice, anything. But the only sound she heard were the hurried movements of strangers. Back in Texas, Trina woke up and reached for her phone. She smiled as she saw the last message from Marsha, the one from dinner the night before. She sent a good morning text, eager to hear how her sister's night had gone. Hours passed, and there was no reply. By evening, Trina's worry deepened. She called Marsha's phone several times, each one going to voicemail. She checked her social media but saw no updates. A knot formed in her stomach as she stared at the silent phone. She told herself that maybe Marsha was just resting. Maybe she was busy. But as the night stretched on, Trina could not shake the growing sense that something was very wrong. Trina sat in her small kitchen, phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her hand shook slightly as she scrolled through old messages from Marsha, rereading the last one she had received. There had been no word from her sister in over a day. She called again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. She called Detective Luis Ramirez, an old family friend who had worked with the local police department for years. Luis answered right away. Trina explained everything, her voice cracking as she told him about the silence, the last texts, the sudden stop in communication. Luis listened carefully, asking for details. He told her to stay calm and said he would make some calls. Within hours, Luis got back to her. His voice was more serious now. He told Trina that Indonesian authorities had flagged the area where Marsha had traveled. It was a known hotspot for crimes involving foreign tourists, especially women. There had been several past reports of disappearances linked to online relationships. Trina felt her heart pounding in her chest. She gripped the edge of the kitchen table, listening closely. Luis suggested that she gather all the details she could. Marsha's flight information, her hotel, the last known contacts. He promised to help coordinate with authorities overseas. Trina nodded quickly, even though she knew Luis couldn't see her. That night, Trina barely slept. She sat on her couch with her laptop open, refreshing Marsha's social media pages again and again. Something strange caught her eye. Demas's accounts were gone. His profile pictures, posts, and contact information had all disappeared. It was as if he had never existed. The next morning, Trina packed a small suitcase. She couldn't wait any longer. She booked the first available flight to Jakarta, her hands trembling as she typed in her credit card information. She called Luis to let him know her plan. He told her to be careful, but she could hear the worry in his voice. At the airport, Trina sat by the window, staring out at the tarmac. She thought about Marsha as a little girl, about their childhood summers, about the way Marsha had always been the quiet one, the gentle one. Trina felt tears sting her eyes, but she wiped them away. She couldn't let herself fall apart now. As the plane crossed the ocean, Trina sat in her seat, staring at the map on the screen in front of her. She thought about the last words her sister had said before leaving. She had sounded so full of hope, so excited for a new beginning. Trina gripped the armrest tightly, silently praying that Marsha was still alive. When she arrived in Jakarta, the heat and noise of the city hit her immediately. She pushed through the crowded airport, looking around with wide eyes, her heart racing. She contacted the local police, introducing herself and explaining the situation. The officers listened carefully and promised they would begin looking into it right away. Trina had checked into a small hotel near the city center. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone, hoping for any sign, any message, any update. But the silence remained. She thought about the man named Demas, the one who had promised Marsha so much. She thought about how quickly he had disappeared. As night fell, Trina looked out of her hotel window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She felt the weight of worry pressing down on her chest. But she was determined. She would not leave this place until she found out what had happened to her sister. Inside the Jakarta police station, Trina sat in a small chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. The officers spoke softly in their own language, pausing now and then to update her in English. She watched their faces closely, searching for any sign of progress, any hint that they were getting closer to finding her sister. The next morning, rumors began spreading. A local contact told police that Marsha had been seen at a market on the edge of the city. Someone claimed they had watched a foreign woman laughing and shopping with a group of travelers. Trina's heart leapt when she heard the news. She rushed to the market with 2 officers by her side, scanning every face in the crowd. But when they arrived, they found nothing. The woman people had seen was a tourist from Germany. She looked nothing like Marsha. Trina felt the air leave her chest as she realized the lead was false. She tried to stay strong, but she could feel the edges of her hope beginning to shake. The next day, another tip arrived. A man had been seen near the hotel where Marsha was last staying. Witnesses described him as foreign, acting suspiciously, lingering near the entrance late at night. Police pulled up hotel security footage and identified the man. They worked quickly, sending officers to track him down. Trina waited anxiously as the hours passed. She sat in the station lobby, holding her phone tightly, willing it to ring. She imagined Marsha alone somewhere, waiting to be rescued, and she prayed that this lead would finally bring answers. But late that evening, the officers returned with tired faces. They had located the man. He was a backpacker from Australia, staying in a nearby hostel. He had nothing to do with Marsha's case. He had simply been drinking at the bar next to the hotel and wandering outside afterward. Trina sat quietly, feeling the weight of disappointment settle on her shoulders. Each time hope rose, it was crushed just as quickly. Each time she thought they were close, the truth slipped away. As she lay in her hotel room that night, staring at the ceiling, she wondered where Marsha was. She wondered if her sister was still alive, if she was scared, if she was waiting for someone to come for her. Trina knew she couldn't give up, no matter how many doors closed. Somewhere in this city, the answers were waiting, and she was determined to keep searching. At the Jakarta police headquarters, the mood had shifted. The police had worked nonstop in the early days. They followed tips that led them to crowded markets, busy streets, and nearby ports. But every lead crumbled. Every location they searched turned up empty. As the days passed into weeks, the urgency began to fade. The local officers shifted focus to other cases. They reassured Trina that they were doing what they could, but their updates became slower. Their voices over the phone grew less certain. They said they had checked all known places. They hinted that maybe Marsha had left on her own. Trina refused to accept that. She sat in her hotel room, pacing the floor, staring at the photos on her phone, scrolling back through old messages from her sister. She knew in her gut that Marsha had not run away. Something had happened, and she was not going to stop until she found out what it was. With shaking hands, Trina called Detective Luis Ramirez back home in Texas. She explained the situation, her voice tense and tired. Luis listened carefully. He promised her he would help, no matter how far away she was. Back in the United States, Luis dug into everything he could find. He reached out to contacts, researched similar cases, and cross-checked names tied to trafficking reports in Indonesia. He spent long nights on the phone, calling in favors, pulling together details that local investigators had missed. Finally, Luis found something that caught his attention. A small pattern in old reports pointed to a particular warehouse on the edge of the city, a place connected to suspicious activity, but never formally searched. He called Trina immediately. He told her to go back to the police and pressed them hard to check the location. Armed with Luis's findings, Trina walked back into the Jakarta police station. She showed them everything Luis had uncovered. At first, the officers hesitated, unsure if this would lead anywhere. But Trina refused to back down. She demanded they search the warehouse. She begged them to treat this as if their own family was missing. Under the weight of her persistence and Luis's credible research, the police finally agreed. They organized a late-night operation to raid the site. There was an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place locals avoided, a place that had raised suspicion for months. Police had been gathering quiet reports about the site, but now there was enough to act. They believed it was connected to a larger ring involved in kidnapping foreign women. Trina clasped her hands tightly as she listened to the officers explain the plan. She wanted to go with them, but they gently told her to wait. She watched from the window as the police vans pulled away, sirens off, moving silently into Jakarta night. The warehouse stood behind a high metal fence, surrounded by weeds and garbage. The police moved in carefully, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, they found stacks of crates, old equipment, and a heavy locked door leading to the basement. When they broke it open, the smell hit them first: stale air, damp concrete, and something else, something with a human scent. In the dim light, they saw several figures huddled on the ground, thin faces, trembling hands, eyes squinting at the sudden beam of the flashlights. Among them was Marsha. She was weak, barely able to lift her head, her skin pale, her frame thinner than anyone remembered. Police called for medical teams immediately. As they began helping the captives out, they searched the room. They found used medical supplies, blood bags, and paperwork. It became clear that these victims had been kept alive not for ransom or labor, but for their blood. Marsha, with her raro-negative type, had been especially valuable. Records showed she had been forced to give blood repeatedly. Back at the station, officers traced the financial trail. Deus's name appeared in several bank transfers. One in particular stood out: a recent payment of $7,500 matching the time Marsha disappeared. On May 3rd, Trina was sitting in a chair, her heart pounding, when the phone finally rang. An officer told her the words she had been aching to hear. They had found her sister. She was alive. Tears ran down Trina's face as she whispered thank you. She gathered her things quickly, ready to rush to the hospital where Marsha was being taken. She didn't know yet what her sister had endured. She only knew she was still here, after weeks of endless searching. Inside the Jakarta police office, investigators worked through the night. Papers were spread across the tables. Phone calls came in and out as officers pieced together the timeline. The evidence led back to Demas. It became clear that Demas was not just a man looking for love. He had been targeting women online, searching for those who were lonely, isolated, and eager for connection. He carefully chose women who trusted easily and who wouldn't raise alarms if they disappeared. Marsha was one of several victims. The investigators uncovered messages between Demas and others, showing a pattern that had played out more than once. He had lured foreign women with promises of romance, invited them to Indonesia, and handed them over to local traffickers for money. Marsha, still recovering in the hospital, gave her first statement to the police. Her voice was weak, but her words were steady. She described the first night at the hotel. She remembered waking up to masked men dragging her from the room. She remembered calling out for Demas, believing he had been taken too. But the moment the blindfold was removed, she saw his face. He stood across the room, smiling and counting the money handed to him. Marsha said it was that moment, that one look, that shattered her. She realized a man she had trusted had never loved her at all. As police continued digging, they uncovered more connections. The trafficking ring stretched beyond Indonesia. There were contacts in neighboring countries and evidence pointing to a wider network that specialized in exploiting rare blood types. Marsha's O-negative blood had made her a prize target. Trina sat beside her sister's hospital bed, holding her hand carefully. She listened as Marsha described the week spent in the basement, the fear, the hunger, the endless blood draws. Marsha said she had lost count of how many times she had been hooked up to a needle. She spoke softly about the other women in the room, all of them trapped, all of them waiting to be rescued. The police worked with international agencies to identify the other victims. They reached out to embassies, traced financial records, and began closing in on the rest of the people involved. As the truth about the trafficking ring became clearer, the Jakarta police and international agencies launched a full-scale manhunt for Demas. His face appeared on wanted lists. Airports were placed on alert. Border checkpoints were given his photo. For weeks, investigators worked with Interpol, U.S. officials, and Indonesian law enforcement. They tracked financial records, searched apartment buildings, and followed tips that came in from the public. But Demas stayed hidden, moving quietly under fake names and switching locations frequently. Finally, on June 4th, 2023, after nearly a month, authorities received a credible tip. Demas had been spotted at a small private airport preparing to board a plane under a false identity. He was dressed in a dark jacket, sunglasses covering his face, blending in among travelers. Police moved in quickly. As they surrounded the airstrip, guards loyal to the trafficking ring opened fire, forcing police to take cover. The scene exploded into chaos. Gunshots cracked through the air as officers returned fire. In the middle of the gunfight, Demas himself pulled a weapon. He fired at the police, running for cover, but he was quickly trapped between both sides. The gunfire continued until Demas was shot and killed on the spot. Once the scene was secured, police moved in to search his body and his belongings. What they found sent shockwaves through the investigation. Demas had been carrying documents detailing the structure of the trafficking network. Names, phone numbers, bank accounts, and routes were listed. There were records of victims moved across multiple countries, including Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. The evidence revealed just how far the trafficking ring reached. Women were being lured from the United States, Europe, and Australia, and funneled through Southeast Asia for illegal blood and organ trade. Authorities immediately launched coordinated raids across these regions using the information pulled from Demas files. They worked to shut down warehouses, rescue victims, and arrest the network's remaining leaders. Although Demas would never face trial, His death marked a critical turning point. His documents provided the key to breaking apart a system that had operated in the shadows for years. For Trina and Marsha, the news brought mixed emotions. On one hand, the man who had caused their families so much pain was gone. But on the other, it meant there would be no chance for Marsha to confront him in court. No chance for him to answer for what he had done. In front of the survivors, Marsha continued her slow recovery at home, supported by her sister and medical professionals. The scars she carried were deep, both on her body and in her heart. But she found strength in knowing that others were being saved because of the evidence recovered. Across the world, survivors and families followed the news closely. Interviews with rescued victims filled television screens. Headlines reported on the international sting operations. Governments promised to increase cooperation and tighten protections for foreign travelers. For the victims, the road ahead was long, but the death of Demas and the collapse of his network brought a measure of justice they had feared they would never see. Trina and Marsha sat together in their quiet home, grateful for the chance to heal and holding on to hope that one day they could leave the darkness of this chapter behind. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next story might hit close. This is Ruthless Realities. Until next time.